Nice. So, before we start talking about the chapters we have for today, 43 to 52 of book one, and the prologue and first two chapters of book two, or part two, I should say. Is there any business, anything not directly related to the reading for today that anyone wants to bring up? Okay, then let's get to it. So the first question that I have for you all, as you've seen, is about this story of love and courtship involving Doña Clara, who is the daughter, I guess the captive's niece, and the daughter of the judge named Juan Perez de Viedma, who is the captive's brother, obviously. And Don Luis, this young nobleman who's wooed her from beyond her windows and has dressed himself up like a footman and sings to her and composes songs and so forth. So, clearly this is one in a string of stories about love and courtship. It strikes me as one of the more minor ones, but there are novel elements in it relative to the ones that we've seen. I mean, two things that stood out to me are, one, that Doña Clara fell for Don Luis without ever having seen anything of him apart from what she could see from beyond the windows of her home, which is kind of interesting. And then there's this trope arising again of somebody involved in one of these courtship dramas dressing up in a disguise. So I don't know what to make of either of those things, but and I'm sure there are other interesting elements in this story that are deserve interpretation, but I'm curious to hear what you all think. If you compare this story with the others we've seen or pick out individual elements, are there any bells that start ringing for you? Any thoughts about this?
Well, I'll start.
Thanks, Jesse.
Well, first, I find it a little hard to keep all these stories straight. So when I read your question, I thought, oh my God, thinking back to the other couples. But one thing I noticed without reading back to the other couples too much is that Don Luis is very much a Don. I mean, he has an attitude that I don't remember the other young men had, this, like feeling like he can order his servants. And he can't. He's saying, I'm not going back there. And there's no way you're going to make me go back there. I'm going to go back when I'm ready to go back. I don't know. He seemed more take charge, or not wanting to take charge, because he actually just comfortable in that role. And so I guess what I'm getting at is that I think there's a little difference you see in his station between the other men. He's of a higher station. He's like, what is a donna? Like just a very wealthy person, but like some sort of royalty or a step down from royalty or something like that. So anyway, I just was noticing that about them.
Okay. Don Luis is unusually imperious with respect to his subordinates, at least insofar he thinks he's driven by love to do one thing and one thing alone, namely stick around. I'm thinking of the other characters you might compare him to along those lines. Don Fernando comes to mind. He's less confrontational, I guess, and more scheming. But perhaps he has moments of confrontation, but it's an interesting.
He's also older. He's a lot older. I think he's older.
He seems more worldly. I think that's gotta be. Other thoughts about this story? Yeah, Con?
I'm not sure this is what you were getting at, but in this story and some others, I just can't help thinking about the famous musical, The Fantasticks, which probably many of you have seen, because, this story, this idea that young people see each other from afar are permitted from, really truly connecting with each other. Their parents intentionally hold them apart so they will fall in love. Like, to me, it's so interesting that this same theme comes up in these stories, only it's 500 years ago, that this idea of forbidden love, maybe it is so prevalent in all the stories, and still a contemporary theme today. So that's what really came out to me in this story, as well as some others.
Okay, so there's at least love at a distance. Is it forbidden? I mean, my sense is that
well, she wasn't, for Don Luis, I mean, he was forbidden from, he takes off to follow Clara, and they chase after him, and they want to make him come back, and he's being forbidden from pursuing what he thinks is his true love. I don't think it's true on her part quite as much, but she's very sheltered and sequestered. She hasn't even had an opportunity to form a real idea of what being in love is all about. In fact, that's common in the stories also, that these young couples believe they're in love without even really being worldly enough to understand what being in love is supposed to be about. And by the way, Don Quixote is also like that, right? Because he's in love with Dulcinea, who is, barely a real person to him.
Okay, so this is another case of love conceived at a distance. I mean, Quixote, has he caught a glimpse of Dulcinea? Sometimes we see it says yes, sometimes no. Yeah, so that's an interesting thought about forbidden love. So it does seem right that Don Luis is being hunted down to prevent him from at least being away from his father, who's heartsick. It seems like in prior stories, women are often kept guarded in one way or another by their fathers or guardians. And in this case, Juan, Doña Clara's father, is oblivious as to what's going on. So there is an element of forbiddenness to this love, but there's a twist on it. I mean, I hadn't thought about it until you mentioned it, Karin. So this seems worth thinking about as, kind of variation on a theme that we've seen. Cindy, go ahead, and then Steve.
So I think what's really different here, not about how the love originates, but what happens is we've now got the lovers, an original pair of lovers, Dorothea and Cardenio, right, who are now assisting a somewhat younger pair of lovers to deal with kind of some of the same things, right? A love that isn't quite smoothly or being allowed to happen. So we've got Dorothea at the beginning hearing the song. I think that's also a little different. We have like a singing lover. So, but I think the bigger difference is you're layering on these groups of lovers. And this one is almost easier, isn't it? I mean, the resolution of it ends up being easier because they have the help of the other pairs of lovers.
Does that have any parallel to the earlier stories, Cindy? I mean, like somebody being the pairs of lovers who are in distress of some kind or facing an obstacle?
I'm trying to think about that. I think in most of them, I mean, the two sets now that are in the inn, they kind of really just all ran around in a circle till they bounced up against each other at the end and everything was solved, I guess. But I don't know that we've previously seen this kind of levels of assistance, lovers helping the other lovers. And because they're all kind of in the higher class, whatever, I don't know what the Don and Donna is either, but they all seem to be Don somebody's. That if you're a Don somebody, you can help another Don somebody, and Don somebody father is gonna listen to you because you're a Don somebody. So that I think helped here too, that he kind of now had somebody to support him who was on the same level as the father, and also could, I guess, influence the judge, in both of those ways. But that's what I thought that the initial way everybody falls in love in this seems to be same. But then that part of that may be the opportunity that people even had to see each other, since all the women were apparently like stuck up in the castle, throwing their hairs out the window or something. I have no idea, but they all seem to be in this protected situation. So how much you'd ever get to really know that person without going through the family seems pretty impossible. But that's what I thought was different from the others and made it kind of more fun.
Thank you. Don and Donya, just to note, is just an indication of nobility. It's like sir and lady, something like that. Steve, and then March.
Yeah, I'm struck with all of the love stories as we kind of put them together in terms of how much of it is an idealized love, which the lovers try to put into actuality. And yes, there's a twist to all of them in terms of how that happens. But very often they fall in love based on seeing him from a window, or hearing about him from afar, and you think about Don Quixote's quest is also about an idealized image that he has in his head, which he's trying to put into reality. Now, a piece of that is exactly that. It's hard to do, earn or deserve the love from the lady Dulcinea del Toboso, but almost all of it. But he's created a mental image of who he is and what he wants to be, and he sets out to make that real. And to some degree, that's the story arc of a lot of the love stories as well, which is one or both of the lovers has a vision of who their true unrequited, who their true love is, not unrequited, but that they want to be with, and they'll do whatever it takes to try to make that come through.
Can you, Steve? So this seems apt insofar as with Don Luis and Doña Clara, their circumstances are such that they could have no knowledge of one another aside from what one could glean from the other side of a window. This is purely superficial in some literal sense. They can only see the surfaces of one another from afar. There's no deep engagement. So you said that you see this in Quixote's idealizing of Dulcinea. It seems like there's really good, straightforward evidence for that. What about the other lovers that you've seen? Are there particular pairings in which this kind of an analysis seems apt, the idealization of one's beloved?
Well, the situation with Zoraida wanting to leave her father and go to Spain has both the quest aspect of it in terms of wanting to become a Christian lady rather than, and then she falls in love with a guy. Again, and all that she's ever done is pass down notes from windows. And again, makes an enormous leap of faith, and it all works out through, or appears like it's going to work out through persistence. So I think that, again, there are the Don Fernando stories are more complex. He gets to know the one, but the other one seems like, the infatuation that plays out. But again, the notion that the kind of the story arc for each of them is visualizing or deciding what the reality is and then making it a reality.
I mean, I was especially curious about this with respect to The Tale of Inappropriate Curiosity, where it seems like a good deal of Anselmo's efforts, at least initially, are aimed at doing the opposite of idealizing, trying to see beyond the veil that he worries that is being held over his eyes with respect to the character of his beloved Camila. So yeah,
you're right. That's more of a counter story, but in a way, again, in terms of, because I've seen the love stories. I haven't plotted them out, but I think you could almost put them on a scale of different types of permutations. I think it's what he's doing for the story interest. And again, the role that Don Fernando plays and that Lucinda finds her, gets pulled into bit by bit is certainly an outlier on that notion. But I guess, kind of reflecting, maybe it's a little bit of the recency effect with Don Luis and Donna Clara, that they're are the closest to Don Quixote. But again, the whole love at first sight, unrequited love, making it real in your mind before you make it real in reality seems, at least in some cases, to be a pretty strong parallel.
That seems fair. And I didn't want to say that the tale of inappropriate curiosity breaks the parallel. I actually think that it seems as if Anselmo is concerned with the very thing that you're describing. He worries that he's going to fall into that, what might be a trap, a deceptive appearance that comes along with the idealization that you see in these other love stories. So I think it's right on theme. It's just playing with the same dynamic. Okay, I saw Marge and then Cindy and then Jess. Sorry, Marge, I think you're muted.
There, sorry. When I was reading this, I found this love story the least interest. I thought it was a little boring. And I don't know why, but I was struck that this may have been I think the only coupling we've seen where the two characters are really on the same social standing. And there's no third or fourth party, no love triangle. It seems sort of straightforward to me. And I'm not sure what the objections are, what was really keeping apart other than that they were so young. I just didn't see as much conflict there or drama, I guess.
Great. I mean, I think that is interesting insofar as, it poses a question that maybe we can answer it and maybe we can't, namely, like, what's the source of the tension in this story? Is it totally artificial that these young people have an obstacle to their consummating their love or, getting married? Or is there something in the story of like the conflict they're dealing with that's actually in some ways interesting, more substantial than it might seem? Thanks, Marge. That's a useful challenge. Cindy, go ahead, and then Jesse.
So I was also trying to compare this to the Tale of the Two Curious Husband, or whatever the title of that is. And so part of what's happening is, even if so these people don't really know each other before they're married. They don't have the opportunity to see each other. They're mostly semi-arranged marriages. Every once in a while, the father picks two and says, which would you like, to the daughter? Do you know what I'm saying? There's a little bit of choice, but that's considered to be very liberal. But even when they get married, they don't know each other. And that's what the Tale of the Two Curious, what Anselmo, I'm not going to ever remember the name of that now, shows, is that even after they're married, he doesn't know his wife, right? I mean, he does. It is almost as if in this book, at least so far, women are unknowable. And by men, at least, I don't know. But not that we know a lot about any of these characters, right? I mean, this isn't, some of this is a little caricature-y for sure, but at least in the romance department, that unknowability of women, you can't ever trust them. There's a theme, this comes up several times. Well, you kind of got to keep your eyes on them all the time, and you don't really know them very well. So all I'm saying is, I think it's a bigger theme than just, I saw you across a crowded room and fell in love with you. Even after they got married, Anselmo didn't really understand or know her at all, which is why all the things that happened could have happened. So I think that's...
How does that play into the story involving Doña Clara and Don Luis? Is there something about their falling in love at this great distance?
I think that's, one of the things, Marge was talking about how much they were the same, and on 416, basically, once Don Luis talks to the father's like, at the end of the one paragraph says, he was very impressed by what Don Luis says, and he was shrewd enough to have realized immediately how advantageous this marriage would be for his daughter, and as long as the father agreed. So it's almost like they didn't have the opportunity. My guess is Don Luis is a poet. He decides he sees the judge and his beloved right away. And so instead of saying to his dad, I like that girl, could you arrange a marriage? He hops on his horse, he follows them, he sings outside the window, and all of this stuff ensues. And when he finally meets the father says, hey, this is actually a very good idea. So in a sense, Marjorie's right. It doesn't quite have the conflict the others did. It was like these two were too young and naive to even figure out how to make it happen, because it could have happened.
Mhm.
So that's, I think, the kind of how it compares to them. But, somebody riding after you and singing songs outside your window, I mean, that's lovely. So that's
How
different.
often does that happen?
Yes, I don't know. Does it happen?
It sounds just as equally liable to be creepy as lovely, but a strange boy from across the street, but fair enough. Jesse, go ahead, and then Steve, and then Rimas.
Just a couple of thoughts I have. This story, Don Luis and Clara, it doesn't have the kind of tragedy in it that the other stories had, although I'm trying to remember Zoraida, that story. But the other stories had real heartbreak and terrible hurt, and the women off to the convent and the men going mad, and this is much more of a tale of young love, simple tale of young love. And like Cindy was saying, it could have worked out, and it probably will work out. But I was thinking, when you brought up the tale of the inappropriate curiosity, that seems to me on a whole different level than these love stories. I don't even see that as a love story. And I don't see that, we talked about this so much last week, there's no need to go over it. But I think that it's not that Anselmo didn't really know his wife, Camilla. He didn't really know himself. I mean, he was asking for his best friend to betray him, to betray Camilla, to betray his honor, Anselmo's honor, Lotario's honor, and he was putting up so many obstacles to Camilla being able to go to him for help. So I feel like it's not that he didn't know her and she turned out to be less trustworthy than he thought. It's that he kept asking for the impossible and the dishonorable. So anyway, we don't have to discuss that, but I don't see that as a kind of love story the way these are at all. I think that it's just there's a different message we're meant to get from that.
I mean, it's a tragic story that involves love and courtship. It's a story about marriage. I mean, obviously it doesn't go well, and it's kind of horrifying, but it's on the same
courtship between whom? Between Lotario and Camilla?
Yeah, for one. It seems like there are three different pairs of lovers in it. Anselmo and Camilla, Lotario and Camilla, and then Leonora and her mysterious man.
Well, I don't think we see much of the courtship between Anselmo and Camilla. We just get a sentence or two saying he fell in love with her and arranged and got Lotario to help arrange his marriage.
Mhm.
And then so and then the courtship between Lotario and Camilla was like something forced and orchestrated by Anselmo. So I don't know. I don't think it's the same kind of thing.
No, surely not. But I think they're pretty closely related. Maybe this is a difference of small degrees of
I
the way we're
really
constructed.
don't like that Anselmo.
No arguments. Steve, go ahead, and then Rumas.
General comment on the love stories. I sometimes think that we, and I very much include myself on the list of we here, are taking them way too seriously. I think they could easily be read as spoofs on love and courtship, where everybody is stupid and misguided and jumping off to rapid conclusions, and young lovers and older lovers and conniving lovers, and people do things to themselves. And to some degree, I think you can see this as a parody or a spoof or a satire on, love in the time of whatever. This is one of those things where, that the knight wanders in to reassert chivalry, is a kind of its own kind of tragic comic element that can look at both ways. But I think that many of these love stories, which again, to modernize, look horrifying, could also be seen as having a Chaplin-esque kind of quality, which is that if you played them for laughs, Anselmo's an idiot. He's an evil idiot, but he's an idiot. And you can see where at the end of the day, what he does is he gets his comeuppance. Okay? He thinks he's so smart and he's conniving and he's got the, but his friends turn the thing on him. And again, I think women get very badly used. Don't get me wrong on that one. But I think that the notion that these are meant to be examples of real love, I think they have truths at the core of them. I think a lot of the book is like that, but I think that they could also be read as simply being outlandish spoofs with crazy characters, with bizarre, we've commented many times about how crazy it is that everybody ends up at the end. I think that's a hint that the love stories that end up there are themselves somewhat outlandish, or meant to be seen as somewhat outlandish.
So what's the correction that you're suggesting here, Steve, in our approach to them, or in just like, what is this interpretation opposed to? Taking them too seriously, or?
Yeah, I think that
there's something.
That, again, I think that in terms of looking at the types of courtship, and I just, as we discuss them, the discussion seems to take each of the individual ones as, serious depictions of love and lovers and their relationships, which I think are meant to be not taken quite as literally or not quite as seriously. I may be totally wrong on that one, but as we were having the conversations, I just thought that there's you get a script and people read Kafka and say, and get the horror and the tragedy and the ambiguity. And he supposedly, when he was reading it to his friends, couldn't help himself from laughing out loud. Because in his mind, what was happening was literally laugh out loud funny. And I think that sometimes we're kind of, like I said, getting a little bit too serious around what are meant to be, and what are, in many cases, laugh out loud funny kinds of sequences.
I guess I suppose, like, as we read this, if something's meant to be funny and we're holding up a magnifying glass and furrowing our brows, that seems like it's a missed opportunity. But are you suggesting that if these are comedic, which they clearly are, there's plenty of exaggeration, forests full of shepherds and a single inn at which all these stories tie up. I mean, yeah, it's all very exaggerated and kind of hyperbolic in the details and silly in some respects. But does that mean that we shouldn't subject them to serious interpretation or have thoughts about them?
No, I think that I'm not suggesting we shouldn't, but subject them to serious interpretation. But I think that sometimes we're still, comedic stuff, which this can certainly be subjected to serious, because you got a dark humor under many of it. But I think to some degree again, may just be my reflecting on relatively little sleep, the conversation. It seems like we're looking fairly darkly at some of these stories. I mean, Don Luis, to me, he strikes me as a impertinent snit. okay, 15 years old, commanding the horsemen, deciding that he's got all the power, and he does, okay? I mean, that's part of the society, but I see him as being, barely shaving. And he's making these huge demands, and the footmen are like rolling their eyes, and like, oh my God, we have to put up with this crap. It's a little bit of the flavor that I get that I think that, like I said, I think it's there more often than not.
Okay, thanks. Rimas, and then I've got Cindy, Larry, Marge, and Carl.
Well, there was one detail that keeps popping up in these stories that I'm not so sure I know what to make of, and that's the window. A lot of these stories have that element in them. And I started to think when I remember the story of Zoraida and the captive, that there's sort of an irony going on, that the captive is in prison, he's in the prison yard, but he's walking freely around in the prison yard, while Zoraida is in a tower looking over the prison yard through a window that has a grate in it. And it almost looks like, well, who's the prisoner here? Maybe she's the prisoner and she's trying to get out of her prison through him. So it could be a reversal. And here's another case of Clara looking through a window, and she's about to be taken by her father to another country. So she's, in a way, seeking to escape. I don't know if what to make of that, but it seems like there is a repetition of that theme of the window. And it almost makes me want to think that Cervantes is saying something about, well, think about things in reverse. Think about it from the other side of the coin. And who's mad, who's sane is another one of these reversal questions. And it's interesting that this scene with Clara and Don Luis is followed immediately by a scene where Maritornes and the innkeeper's daughter tie up Don Quixote, and he's hanging from a window. I don't know what if there's a connection there or not. I can't quite see it, but there's windows keep popping up in this book.
So the other window that I can think of that plays into one of these love stories is Lucinda's window. It seems like Lucinda communicates with Cardenio through her window frequently. I'm not sure that it serves the same function of acting like the window of a prison. Maybe it does for Lucinda in a way that I think you were suggesting, Rimas, that insofar as Zoraida's grated window is like a prison window from which she needs to be rescued by the prisoner, ironically, there's something about Doña Clara's situation, her being confined within her father's house and being carted off to Mexico with no say of her own in the matter. And we learn when she wakes up crying, or starts crying on hearing that this footman singing, who turns out to be Don Luis, that she's being taken somewhere against her will. She's in love with this man. She would rather stick around with this boy. So I think you were suggesting that there's something about the Doña Clara's father, Juan's wishes, life plans for her that are equivalent to Zoraida's metaphorical prison, modeled on the actual prison that the captive is in. I mean, that's really interesting. I hadn't thought about the parallel between these windows. I think this calls out for interpretation. So I'd be happy to hear if people have thoughts about this. Thanks for this. It's an interesting detail. Cindy, go ahead, and then Larry, Marge, Tom.
I don't, because I was actually going back to what Steve said, so I hadn't thought about the windows. But in a lot of ways, I think what Steve is saying is not that you can't analyze these, But what is the flavor or the intent of this book when someone picks it up, and particularly maybe at that time, I think is likely lighter than necessarily we're going to, look at it. Even the tale of the curious husband thing, when they finish that, doesn't the priest say to the barber, like, this was a really pretty good tale, and he didn't say this was a terrible tragedy. It was more like this was very entertaining. And then they get another one they think is written by the same guy and say, oh, good, because the last one was really good. I mean, it's a little bit like these could be the rom-coms of their age, right? There's pattern in a rom-com. They meet cute, and then something happens, and there's always something that they're not going to get together at the end, and then they do. And the nature of the entertainment is light. You kind of usually, if you've seen enough of them, know where it's going. I think depending on your age, you take it less seriously or more seriously the younger you are, maybe. But and someone could probably do a thesis about what rom-coms tell us about love in modern, in the modern era. But it wouldn't be exactly, I don't think most of us would read it and say that's really, like, it isn't really set out there to be a truthful tale of love. That's all I'm saying. And I think that's what Steve's saying too. Of course, these patterns may mean something, and they may tell us something about the, the society. But as you read them, it seems to me that they're presented here, at least on one level, for entertainment. And that's why they have the humor, and I think it's also why we see a lot of the pattern.
Yeah, sure. They're entertaining. I mean, I think this is true about like most literature that we actually feel like reading, that it's entertaining. I mean, I accept all this. What I'm curious about is like, what difference does all of that make in the way that we should read it? What I asked Steve was, at our first pass reading, if we don't think it's funny, or like we don't think it's trying to be funny, or it doesn't hit us in our funny bone, or whatever it is, then yeah, something's probably going wrong. We're missing the genre. But is that the only difference that you see this making? Is it just like, we should recognize this as a comedy, or should we take it to be lighter than it might seem otherwise? Or
No, I'm saying that just like you can take a society's comedy or entertainment and see something deeper into it, that we can do that, but you can do it on all of those levels.
Yeah.
And not assume that everyone during this time period only fell in love with the person they saw through the window, though it may be possible.
Not. Yeah, this is not a work of sociology. Yeah, this is a strange and fantastical set of stories. This actually, all this material from these thoughts, Steve and Cindy, about genre seem really closely related to the discussions of the value of books of chivalry generally, and literature that we're going to talk about, that the priest, the canon, and Quixote have in chapters 47 to 50. So I imagine these thoughts are going to be with us in all of the like literary critical passages in the novel. So stay tuned. I think these are all, they'll pick up steam, and I think find a good home when we discuss that stuff. Larry, go ahead, and then Marge Carney.
Noah, picking up on your thought and thinking about the structure of this novel, it struck me that it takes place on three planes, or on three levels. Regarding these love stories, they strike me as being sort of an anthology of love stories, describing all the twists and turns, permutations that love can take. The next level that comes to mind is, well, perhaps I don't know that it's the main level, is Don Quixote and his obsession with knighthood and chivalry and romance and virtue and uplifting and saving the underdogs, and his relationship with Sancho. And then the third plane is that of the priests, the judges, the people in sort of institutional power. And the various planes, they all intersect, but they all deal with sort of like self-delusion, with idealism, with a reality that doesn't seem to exist. I mean, each of the planes bump into one another, and sort of move the story, the novel forward. So I was just thinking about this in terms of trying to get my hands around, sort of the underlying structure, of this novel.
That's useful, Larry. So we've got the anthology of love stories level, the Quixote and his story with Panza level, and then the story about these institutional authority figures of some kind. It's that last one. I mean, we've got at least one of those in this scene. I mean, there's Juan, the judge. There's also the priest, and to a certain extent, various noble people gathered in the inn here. How does so I see how idealism and construing the world fantastically, being borne along by lofty ideals or sort of hyperbolic conceptions of your own life or your beloved or things like that, the values by which you live, play into those first two levels. That seems like relatively straightforward. What do they have to do with the third level, the level of the people who have some kind of institutional authority? Do you have any thoughts about that?
Well, they create. I think, in my reading of it, they create power structures within this society, in terms of the the church, of what's determining what's right, what's wrong, the status of individuals within this society. I mean, it's clear to me that it's a very male dominated culture that we're looking at here. Really, the only exception to that seems to be the story of Marcella. Other than that, it seems that women are really not secondary in importance in terms of the stories, but treated sort of in a second-class way. I'm thinking of the story we'll get to probably later. I think it's Leandra. Is it Leandra? And I've forgotten who the male interest is, but there are a couple of paragraphs describing his feeling about how unreliable and sort of like flaky, women can be, and untrustworthy. This type of phenomenon.
Mm-hmm.
So, and I think in answer to your question, they represent the power structure and perhaps the moral structure of this story.
So it's almost like they provide the background against which the idealizing of the other two layers takes place.
Yes, and I think that they're just as disillusioned in many ways. When I think of the discussion between the priest from Toledo and the other priest, in the conversation with Don Quixote about tales of knighthood. I mean, each of their points of view seem to me off base to a large degree.
Interesting. Well, I'm going to be curious to hear your thoughts when we get to that episode and the episode involving Eugenio or Eugenio and the.
Yeah.
Marge, go ahead. And then.
Oh, I just really had more of a question. And it maybe fits in with what Steve was saying, is what's with every woman being more beautiful than the one before? And I'm wondering what these people must look like by the time you've gotten to 5 or 6 women who are the most beautiful until they meet the next one who's even more beautiful. is this a throwback to the Fair Maiden of the Night Tales, or yeah, the only woman I think that doesn't come off well is Don Quixote's Dulcinea, whatever her name is, Dulcinea, the one he thinks is the queen of the inn or the castle. It seems like it's really objectifying the women. There's something beautiful to look at, and they're virtuous. That seems to be the only two traits that matter at all through these stories. It's just a trend I was curious about.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, it reminds me of Hollywood movies.
Yeah, exactly.
Homer to a certain extent. Yeah, I mean, it's not like there's no parallel for these things, but it is striking that every woman, aside from Marie Tornes, who gets introduced, is described as, heart-stoppingly beautiful. All the men around them are stopped by their beauty. It's very strange.
Mhm.
Karen, go ahead, and then April, and then Sue.
Well, but I agree with Marge on how many absolutely beautiful women can there be, but that wasn't the point I was going to make. So what I keep thinking about is throughout the book, we've talked about, what is madness? Is Don Quixote mad? What is madness? And Cervantes doesn't use the term here, but, love sickness is a madness that we ascribe to love. In fact, Shakespeare at this time is using this idea of love sickness. And, you look at these lover stories and, they're sweet and they have happy endings and they're comedic and they're funny, but, they're a little crazy. Like there's some madness to these love stories too. To me, it kind of gets at the question, what makes someone mad? Because these lovers, they do some quote unquote mad things. I mean, isn't it mad to be so upset that you run off and you disguise your sex, or that you go from riches to rags instead of rags to riches, the people who are wandering around in the wilderness. And so I don't know, but it just occurs to me that there's an element in every story about who is the mad person here, or is there some sort of madness to this situation, because it's not a normal situation.
Yeah, it seems like Cervantes is really interested in this thought that there's a parallel between madness, whether the kind that we see Quixote having or madness in general, and what the mindset of someone who's in love, or love obsessed or love lorn, or some touched by love in some manner. I was going to ask you to try to say in general, Karen, like what marks the madness of the lover in these various stories? Is it that they are oblivious to other concerns that we would normally have, that they do things that, for instance, they don't care about money, they don't care about violating social strictures, about making their fathers really upset about that they go missing?
To me, the mark of the madness is the obsession. I mean, these are very obsessive loves.
Yeah.
I can't live without this one person. I will, upheave my entire life because my one obsessive love has been taken away from me.
Right.
I mean, and that is not so different from Don Quixote's obsession with being part of the world of knight errantry. It's, just that looks crazier to people because we all have this sort of warm, positive feeling about love, but we think, knight errantry is a thing of the past, and it's kind of crazy to pursue that.
So it's monomania. It's like being able to think only one thought. That seems characteristic of a lot of these lovers, and also of Don Quixote, albeit.
Well, I didn't know about thinking one thought, but thinking only of one person.
Yeah.
Only of, right? It's not just one thought. It's like if I can't have this passion of mine,
Yeah.
You know, I can't live without it. Don Quixote is saying that. Later on, he says that basically, you know, to the barber and the priest, like, I can't live without this idealized world that I'm so passionate about.
Thank you. April, and then Steve, Jesse, Larry.
I do agree with the dramatic love that Karen was just speaking of, but I wanted to pick up the window theme that Remus had put in the hopper. I agree. There's always some sort of barrier or obstruction, or this window. It seemed like it's kind of framing all these different love stories and framing it's obscure clarity, which I find really interesting because there are moments when I see Don Quixote and I think he's really mad, as we're supposed to, but then other times he has a thread of reality in what he's saying. And anyway, I'm just curious if we could pick up the window again, if other people have some more thoughts on the window and how that comes into play, and why is it there? Why is there always an obstruction where people can't communicate clearly and they have to sort of they have to fill in the gaps of the conversation or the reality because there's this barrier.
That's interesting. So April, it sounds like you're taking the significance of the window in a slightly different manner from Remus, although they're closely related. So Remus, I think, emphasized the way in which a window imprisons and is a practical impediment to the love of these two, lover and beloved, or the two lovers. And you're saying that the window is a block on clarity. It's more like an epistemic barrier. It distorts or in some ways hems in these characters' understanding of one another, of the world on the other side of the window. So now we've got at least two senses of what these windows, what function they serve in these stories, and what they might represent. Does that seem fair, the way that I interpreted that thought, April?
Absolutely. I think in the beginning of our discussions, I had mentioned the layers, though there's a lot of layers in this book. And I think the window for me represents a betweenness where the author or the narrator or both, they want the reader to be in this constant state of in between, trying to figure out what's real, what's not real, who's who in the zoo, what's going on. And I think the window is that's part of the theater of it. That's part of the drama that the author is building.
Thanks. It's an interesting thought. Steve, go ahead, and then Jesse, and then Larry.
Yeah, slightly different angle. This may actually be jumping more to one of the later questions. As we're having the discussion, I just kept thinking, Don Quixote is us. Okay, he's going out there trying to recreate a world of chivalry because he thinks we've lost it. And he's thinking that, and he's a character of the story, but he's also the guy that we're rooting for in the story. And I'm just thinking about the parallels in 20th century kind of crime and thriller fiction. I mean, thinking about, we still have chivalric tales we all love. I mean, think about the character of Philip Marlowe in the Chandler books, where he goes off as a detective to kind of right the wrongs for women, and the women are ultimately either, they're all, by the way, they're all more beautiful than the next one out in Hollywood. And some of them need to be saved, and some of them turn out to be temptresses, you never know. And then you think about the Jack Reacher series, okay? He's going from one, going from one town to the next, looking to solve the crime. There's inevitably a woman who's involved with it, who either needs to be saved or is, being sought after. And so this notion of wanting to maintain or bring back that idealistic element in fiction is kind of it's another level to the story, where what Cervantes is using Don Quixote is, yes, he's a bit of a buffoon in the way he goes after it, but there is really a truth beyond the Charlie Chaplin aspects about human nature and about our need for people to do that. And how much we get out of and root for the people who do that and idealize them.
So wait, is the thought that insofar as there's evidence from these other genres and their more contemporary the stories, genres that are more contemporary, and the instantiations of that you mentioned, examples, that when we tell ourselves stories of a certain kind, they have elements that we might recognize from Quixote's books of chivalry, his ideal construal of his own world, from the love stories within this novel. And so Quixote, in casting himself as a protagonist in a certain genre of story that has all these trappings that we kind of demand from the fiction that's served up to us, that he's like us in that respect. Is that the thought?
Absolutely, that we're like him. It's not, I mean, he's like us, but it's more like we are more like him than we recognize.
Mhm.
In the desire to engage, maybe fictitious, and the desire to engage fictitiously, if not really, in these kind of pursuits. And they play at a very basic need of ours to have heroes who go out to fight the bad, to fight the bad guys, which sometimes turn out to be windmills and sometimes turn out to be true evildoers. And this notion of having to, or doing it in the service of love, and whether it's the chivalric love or the 20th century endings tend to be a little bit more graphic than that. But I think there's something very basic there that maybe Cervantes is using Quixote to say, this is an element that's been lost to literature and the spirit of our times. And Quixote is setting out to bring that spirit back. And it turns out, again, it's not just something that's from 400 years ago, isn't that neat historically. We keep creating that need, or keep having that need, whether it's the 1950s or the 2020s.
Thank you. Jesse, and then Larry.
Well, two thoughts. I think obsessive love is it's not unique to this book. I mean, the stories of obsessive love happen from, go back to Helen in Paris, and continue up, look at Swan in Swan's Way, and Odette, and obsessive love is part of the human story. So, but that's not what I was mainly thinking. I don't know where this comes in to any of the questions for this week, but I just wonder if other people have this feeling. It's very disturbing to me how cruel people are to Don Quixote, and how they make him, they play tricks on him to get a laugh amongst themselves. They use him as their entertainment. So it leads me to wonder, when Larry was talking about the institutional level or the institutional plane, those people do the same thing. And the Maratones, I mean, her tying his arm up to the window. I mean, the cruelty that almost all of these characters show towards him in terms of using him for their merriment. I just find that very disturbing, and I wonder if there is any the attitude towards madness, or how people treat those who are mad. I'm not sure what question I'm posing, but it's something that I've noticed that I really think gets carried to extremes. And then, Don Quixote acts very, it hurts people for, because of his own misperceptions about them. But I don't know. I just wonder if others have noticed that, or if that's anything that is of particular importance in this book.
Well, it's directly related to the episode I asked about in question 2, where the priest, along with a number of other people who are of sound mind at the end, swear on Quixote's behalf that the Barber's Basin is Mambrino's home, and that the the other barber. I wish Cervantes had named them, or at least used the first barber's name more often. That his donkey's pack saddle is comparison, horse's comparison. So this is, I think, one of a number of episodes in which it seems like people self-consciously and deliberately treat Quixote as a clown, as a figure of fun. They exploit his madness, it seems, in order to get a laugh. And there's an immediate victim, although only temporary, namely this second barber. So I think this is a good question in general. What do we make of how people treat Quixote for good, and in this case, for ill? I think this is also clearly related to Larry's thought about, and I think you drew this in, Jesse, about the role that people at this institutional level, like not the people who belong to the anthology of love stories, not Quixote and Panza, but everyone else, many of whom have some kind of authority, social or official, what role they play in the story. In this case, as the second barber, the minor character barber says, he says that he swears that they're all wrong, that this is a pack saddle and not a comparison, but then it's the lords that make the laws, and he'll say no more. So I'm glad, Larry, that you have your hand up next, because I was going to ask you to talk about this anyway, but I'm sure you had a different thought. Question 2 is on the table, but go ahead.
First of all, Jesse, I think that you're right on the money. There is a theme of sadism that runs through this novel, both physically and psychologically, that I don't think can be denied at all. But when you actually step back and think about the physical pummeling that these characters, undergo, it's amazing that the story doesn't end at round 1. What I wanted to say to Karin, you were talking about madness in the novel and its various guises. How about the reader the reader participating in this madness? I mean, just think about what we do each week in terms of the time and devotion, to prepare the reading, to understand the questions, and come to this class. I was thinking about it yesterday. I was getting a haircut, and I was sitting in the barber's chair, looking at the barber's basin. I mean, not only did Mambrino's helmet, come to mind, but I had this white, this white cloth over me, and I felt like a couple of characters in the novel. I was looking, the basin, the barber's basin actually had a small crack in it. And my imagination just started like running away with me. And so this novel has begun to, infect, it's sort of invaded my consciousness, on a daily level. And it was just sort of a hilarious aha moment. So.
Okay, so this is one thing that we do with these books. We care about them intensely. We don't, because they're funny, we don't treat them as frivolous or something.
You begin internalizing them in the same way Don Quixote has internalized the tales of knighthood, knight errantry, and chivalry, and all that. They become part of our consciousness, and that may be part of what Cervantes is talking about in this novel.
We're told when we teach undergraduates that we have some kind of in loco parentis function, but maybe there's some kind of duty of care in the event that I see anybody really slipping into the fantasy of these novels to alert proper authorities or something. But I think you're still with us, Larry. I'm glad to see. Charles, go ahead.
I like what Jesse said about the cruelty to Don Quixote. There's a slight twist on it as far as I'm concerned, and that is he puts himself into a situation where he's almost setting them up. He puts himself into situations where it's not hard to pick on him, but then there's another part of the cruelty, and that is he's cruel to Sancho several times, and And that's what I noticed. More, it doesn't come up very much so far, but he is cruel to Sancho.
Yeah, Sancho, it seems like he's like a subordinate Don Quixote. He can take lots of punishment and
Yeah.
keeps coming back for more. Or have I mentioned in this class, I had a friend who put this really nicely in an article that he wrote that I was helping him work on. And he was talking, among other things, about clowns and what they are and what role they play in our imaginations of the world. And he said, one thing he said about them is that they're frequently hurt and never in any enduring way harmed. It's as if, we can see them undergo horrible things and they just bounce right back, and it preserves this it allows us a kind of safe sadism, fantasy of seeing somebody get punished without there being any serious consequences for them. It sanitizes it a bit. And I think that's true about Quixote and Sancho Panza. There are not any very serious consequences for the horrible things that they suffer, but man, they suffer a lot of horrible things. Any other thoughts about question 2, this scene in which, on the one hand, the people who should know better play with the barber and with Quixote, they indulge his madness just for the sake of having a little fun. And on the other hand, the barbers remark that although things clearly are, so he'll swear, not as all these fine people say they are, it's the lords that make the laws, and he'll say no more. And he goes on to say a few things, but a few more things. But any other thoughts about this scene? Yeah, Jesse, and then Larry.
Well, the lords should protect the weak and the vulnerable. And in this case, they take advantage. They make the vulnerable an object of derision and fun. But Don Quixote has the right idea. He sees it, he fulfills it sometimes in the wrong way. Well, pretty much most of the time in the wrong way. But he's got the right idea. But the lords that make the laws, they should be the ones who want to protect the weak and vulnerable, but they don't. So maybe that's the point, one of the points in this book. I was looking on the back of my copy, and it says this voted the greatest book of all time by the Nobel Institute. And I was thinking, well, it's got to have some very big themes to be voted the best book of all time. And maybe this idea of the people who are the people who have the right to, does anybody have the right to take advantage of the weak and vulnerable? But particularly those who have the power and the means to do otherwise.
I mean, Jesse, does it matter that in this case things work out pretty well for everyone, for the barber as well as for Quixote? Is this not a kind of vexing but harmless kind of fun? I mean, they seem to be ridiculing Quixote by indulging him to a certain extent. Does it matter that there's no real harm done, or what do you think?
Well, if he were not mad, I think about people who don't know any better, who are teased for other people's entertainment. Maybe people who have some great learning disability or something, or yeah, it does matter. It matters because of what it says about the people doing the teasing. It does matter. I mean, it matters in how we want to. It may not have come to any harm, but if Don Quixote had known that he was being the victim of this teasing, I think that's not the right word. I mean, think about his dignity and his kind of worth as a human being. You know, when you behave cruelly to somebody, it doesn't just hurt that person you behave cruelly to, as the Anselmo Lothario story shows us. It hurts the person who does it, the person who receives it, the people who are part of it. Anyway.
Thank you. Larry, and then Cindy and Steve.
I think everybody is harmed in one way or another. In this particular scene, the barber is paid by the priest. Like, isn't he given some money or something for the barber's basin? But he's left wondering. He's left wondering about those in power and their credibility and their truthfulness. And I think, you know, I just think that everybody is harmed in a certain way. It may not be apparent at first, but the scene with Don Quixote being carted off, he's on an ox cart in a cage. To me, is one of the saddest images that I have in this particular novel. Here you have a guy with a noble sense of idealism and so forth. Yes, he's mad and so on and so forth, but to be portrayed like a caged animal, I think is just a very sort of pathetic image.
Oh, great. So I want to ask about that one too. Does it matter that they're trying to help him? I take it this is not an uncommon treatment of people who are deemed not to be in their right mind and are harmful to themselves and others, namely that they're imprisoned with the justification that it's for their own good as well as for other people's. Does that matter in this case, Larry?
It did to me as a reader, in visualizing the scene. It just a very dehumanizing portrayal of a literary character. I know he's fictitious. I know he doesn't really exist, but in my mind, as a reader, he exists.
Thanks for telling me that. I won't alert the authorities yet to have them come take you away. Cindy, go ahead, and then Steve.
So, I can see what people are saying about the brutality of it. Again, I didn't view it as being written in that sense. I viewed it more as, I don't know, huge kind of opera buffo or something like that, as opposed to a Charles Dickens story where power is not used appropriately to help the poor. So I'm not saying it isn't there, but I guess my reading of it, what I thought it was aiming at, especially where he says the Lords make the laws and I'll say no more, is what's happening when we look at these lovers. We see people, we start out thinking or being told, actually, the narrator, author, whoever, at the beginning says this man went mad from reading these books. But then as you keep going through this, is he mad? Is he not mad? How mad is it? Who decides what madness is? Who decides what real is? And when you get the lovers who act mad in many ways, not mad in the same way as Don Quixote, but who have, you might say, if you were the person in power, our third level of people, well, this person has kind of lost grasp of reality, okay? Or, they're overreacting. And yet now we've got the people who are supposedly the people who see reality talking in a way. Now they know it's reality, but when the guy says basically, yeah, it's real because you say it's real, isn't that very often the case? That who defines what is real, and is the powerful people, in addition to being particularly mean, perhaps the power structure, the people who are in a more structured, I mean, we get to the story about the madman in the prison, it really gets confusing, right? Like, is he crazy? Is he not crazy? But I just thought it had more to do with levels of who defines what's real and what madness is. And in that, I was really taken when on 458, when Don Quixote is talking, I think he's talking to the canon about being a knight errant. And I thought this was beautiful. He said, speaking for myself, I can say that ever since I became a knight errant, I have been courageous, polite, generous, well-bred, magnanimous, courteous, bold, gentle, and he has this whole list, except that a short time ago I found myself in a cage. But it's basically by saying, by believing this, it brought out the best in me. It's kind of like, positive thinking, but in a bigger thing. So I guess I saw this. I certainly don't deny what people are saying about that, the meanness of it, but I thought it was more introducing the idea of the levels of people and who that madness starts running through all these groups.
I mean, that's interesting. It sounded initially like you were characterizing these lords who make the laws, this proverbial application of the proverb to this instance. It sounded like you were saying, well, these people are sane, and by virtue of their high birth, their official positions, their consensus, and their just desire to have some fun, they make Quixote's mad construal of the basin and, as they imagine, the ass's pack saddle, the things that he sees them to be. It's like they make madness official by an act of will, or at least a particular mad thought, which is tricky. I think that's a nice way of analyzing what's going on in this scene, and what it seems like I was getting from what you were saying, Cindy, is the prerogative of the powerful. They get to do that and have other people assent to what seems to those other people to be straightforwardly wrong, but they have it on the authority of people who, by virtue of their position and status, are allowed to just dictate what the truth is. So it's an interesting inversion of Quixote's position. He's mad, declared mad, but as you pointed out, in some ways ennobled by his madness. These people take an element of his mad thinking and use it for the sake of a frivolous bit of fun to mess with Quixote and with the barber.
I do agree with that, but also I'm suggesting that just because they can do it doesn't mean they define reality, okay? And some of those people doing that are basically, right, aren't they some of the lovers that we've already seen have gone a little mad themselves. So in that sense, I'm just pointing out that they can do that because they've got the power. But I wouldn't necessarily concede that when the powerful say it, it's real. And I think, what he's saying is, I'm going to act like it's real because you're powerful and you said it, but I know what reality is. That's what right. Barber 2 is saying, right? Like, I know you're crazy, but as long as you're going to say it, I'm going to go along with you. And, in this case, it's a joke, but in many times powerful people say things that aren't true and make them true because they say them.
Right.
So I guess I'm saying that the nature of this book is as it's questioning reality and madness, as it's questioning madness and levels of madness, isn't going to leave out. There aren't a group of people that I think have 100% reality, and the lovers kind of get us there by seeing what happens to people when they become obsessed in love.
Thanks. Steve, go ahead.
Noah, this will hark back to the last quarter, but we're still living in Thucydides' world, okay? The powerful do what they can, the weak suffer what they must. That's the ethos that Don Quixote is fighting against. that all, what you've got in The Cage and Larry is just right on in terms of that's heartbreaking. They put idealism in a cage. All those good virtues that Don Quixote says about what he is because he's going off on the quest. He's become good, he's become kind-hearted, he's an idealist, he's trying to right wrongs. That's what society, the powerful who can do what they can because they are powerful, have decided to put in a cage. And I think that's why it's so heartbreaking.
Mm-hmm. I mean, does it matter that Quixote, even if he's well-intentioned and like has these virtues, does ask his victims? I'm not sure they would agree to this list of virtues that he's claims for himself. I mean, he does lots of harm. Does that matter to your reading of this image, namely the powerful by virtue of their being in this league of sanity to suppress the idealists or something like that?
Well, you think about the modern day residents. I mean, what do powerful autocratic governments do to political dissenters? They decide that they're mad and put them in mental institutions. I think that that's the world. I mean, you don't want to be too bleak, but certainly in Cervantes, I mean, he's very clearly, forget the list of wonderful things that he pats himself on the back with. The one thing he clearly is an idealist going off in search of making that ideal a reality, both in terms of love and in terms of protecting the weak, and frankly, all those good Christian virtues that everybody says is so important to them, about taking care of the poor. And what's the end result of book one? He has to ride home believing that he believes that he's deluded by an enchanter, and he allows himself to be put in a cage.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I guess what I was asking, Steve, is it's true that autocrats will put their political opponents in mental institutions, claim they're crazy or confine them somehow and say they're criminals or badly intentioned. And those same people who are deemed politically undesirable or whatever will don the mantle of idealism. But it's also the case that lots of people who have donned the mantle of idealism are like Quixote in important other respects, namely, they're deluded. They're genuinely deluded. They claim heroic value to what they're doing, and they think ever since this is very close to home in our sort of conspiratorial political climate, but ever since I started realizing that there was a deep conspiracy somewhere that I had to fight against, it's been ennobling. And in Quixote's case, it seems like the people who cage him are right that far. He is genuinely mad in important respects, which is not to say that
clearly, I mean, he has developed essentially a conspiracy theory of enchanters. Okay, right. Whenever he runs into something that doesn't work out the way he thinks it should, given by his lights and his idealism and his strong right arm, okay, inevitably people will tell him, people will try to tell him the truth. Sancho being the most obvious example. And his first answer is, Sancho, you're right. But that is because the enchanters, okay, who are the key to this conspiracy theory, have changed it, have put me in this cage and have made you think that all these things are true. I mean, you're exactly right, that the notion of putting political undesirables in madhouses would not be such a great technique, but for what you say, which is that very often people who are mad are also espousing things that are politically incorrect or undesirable. But it is nonetheless very poignant for them as well, and for us to look at them.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I take it this is part of what's interesting about Quixote, is that he doesn't slot neatly into either of those narratives. He belongs to both of them. He's genuinely mad. He's also clearly admirable in that he embraces idealism, suffers for it. Gary, go ahead.
Well, and that's sort of the brilliance of, I think, of the character. Just when you're sympathetic for him, you realize he's dangerous. Think of all the people he could have killed. Think of the priests he attacks because he has hallucinations that they're somehow an enemy. I mean, as you were sort of saying, Noah, you know, extremists, even people who think they're purists, who think they're idealists, but are extremists, can be extraordinarily dangerous. And Quixote sort of has both those streams in him. And you know, I don't know if it's a brilliant character, a maddening character, or we just don't know enough about him yet to really figure out why in the hell Cervantes has created him the way he's created him. But I mean, unlike some of you, I have a hard time being sympathetic or feel sorry for Don Quixote, because as noble as he thinks he is, he's also a scary guy. And scary guys like him get locked up by society to protect people like us. So he's a puzzling, fascinating character.
Yeah, I think it's funny that you're right, Gary. It's the first thing he does. One of the first things he does when he's let out of that cage is he goes and attacks a bunch of priests, or penitents, I guess I should say. And Panza says to him on 470, "What demons have you got inside your breast, egging you on against our holy Catholic faith?" Not the first time he's attacked a bunch of clerics. You know, literally the people who are supposed to stand for peacefulness and righteousness in this society.
And I have to say, the other thing about Sancho is another great example of a sympathetic character, but who speaks truth to Don Quixote. But he's also a great enabler. I mean, Quixote couldn't possibly survive to continue to be crazy and dangerous without Sancho.
So I take it we wouldn't ascribe to Panza the same degree of culpability that we might ascribe to these lords making the laws in the inn, in that he's partly taken in by Quixote's stories that Quixote is going to either marry a princess or make him an earl. But he is in a position that's kind of similar to anyone else who might knowingly aid Quixote in his illusions. He's in a similarly morally ambiguous position in that respect. He doesn't seem like he's entirely clear-sighted, and on the other hand, for largely self-interested reasons, but also out of devotion to Quixote, you're right. He's a sine qua non, without whom not for Quixote's harmful to himself and others adventures. I don't know what we should do with that. Like, if we can parse the various degrees of culpability that Panza has relative to anyone else who might abet Quixote knowingly in his madness. I mean, I think we are in the territory of question 3 now, and question 3 I think is a big one, so I don't imagine we're going to get very far into this before the break. But the details of these theories, it's not the first time, it's probably the 3rd or 4th time that we've had something like a discussion of literature and of literary practice within the novel. The details are all really interesting. I don't know what to do with them. There's a mess of them in chapters 47 to 50. If people have thoughts about these in general, I'd be curious to hear them. If I might at some point do what I did with Lothario's speech to Anselmo, refusing to, or trying to convince him not to go ahead with his test of Camilla and point us to certain passages. But before I do that, in the event that I don't need to do that, what stands out to you in this discussion? I think we're already kind of in the territory of thinking about the role of lords or official people who chastise folks like Quixote and maybe lovers for their slipping into fantasy. We've been talking about the value of these stories, the way that stories work on us, the way they work on Quixote. What do you think about what the canon of Toledo, the priest, and Quixote say in this exchange? Anything stand out? Yeah, Larry?
One thing that I'm not sure about how accurate my perception of this is. But one thing I was reminded of in the discussion that the priest from Toledo has reminded me of a bit of the Republic on the discussion of poetry, of poets and poetry and their role in society, in terms of being perhaps harmful in a way, in terms of not representing in other words, not representing reality as it exists, as being a distraction. Is there any truth to that, or I mean, does it make any sense at all, or is
Of
it
course,
completely far-fetched?
No, I think I mean, the various characters who seem to disapprove, they're often religious figures who disapprove of books of chivalry or various literary genres or literary practices in this novel, always have a set of concerns that are not too far from Socrates in books 2 and 3 of the Republic, if not also book 10. A general censoriousness, a worry about genres leading various literary genres and the examples of exemplary works within them, steering their audiences away from the truth in some respect. And that's clearly on the priest's, the canon's lips in this exchange. I think we're gonna have to get further into this after the break. First step in.
Oh, at the break, okay.
Okay, I'll come back to you, Larry. Hold whatever thought you're about to express. See y'all in 15 minutes, 7:46 my time. People have their cameras off, but can hear my voice. Come on back in. So Larry, you were working on this thought about how there's something Socratic, maybe Platonic sounding in the canon's censorious remarks about how books of chivalry and maybe plays lead people astray, what kind of damage they do, how they're poorly made. And you had another thought. What was the thought?
Later, I think it's maybe in chapter, I forgot what chapter it is. Later on, the priest suggests that the Don Quixote leave the works of chivalry behind and pick up the Old Testament and look at some of those stories for truths and insights and reality. And he's just, kind of like exchanging one, craziness for another, another, one set of myths and beliefs with another set of myths and beliefs. And I just thought that was kind of an interesting exchange.
Yeah, so I think that might have been chapter 49. I'm looking back at my notes. So he says either you should read, there's plenty of exciting stuff in the Bible, and there are also histories that are full of the kinds of incidents that you get in books of chivalry, but they're true. It seems like is the thought. They have the advantage of being true.
Right.
And you're saying that would be exchanging one kind of.
I thought how ironic, how ironic, a suggestion that this priest is making.
Okay, thanks. Cindy?
So I thought this discussion followed somewhat of the pattern of the when the priest and the barber are throwing the books out, because it starts out with this: these are all terrible books. Well, except for this one, and I enjoyed this one, and well, that one's not too bad, and this one has so. And we have that, I mean, in this, the canon starts out, these are terrible, and I kind of liked on 441 where he says there's no ingenious artifice, given the title of the book. So he's got nothing good to say, and then the priest is like, well, that's great because I threw them all out, though perhaps some of them allow for exciting stories, and if they're done right. And then you find out in the next chapter that Canon is writing one of his own. Okay, so we've upped the hypocrisy in a way, it's as if they feel obliged, or like, this is a thing we shouldn't like because it's not true and it's not history and it's not the Bible and it's not, but damn, it's fun to read. And then all of a sudden, so that was to me again, but only in a bigger sense, because when the canon said, I'm writing one, I just thought that was like hysterical, actually, though also the height of hypocrisy. It's like, I'm right, but I really shouldn't be in my position, so maybe I won't show anyone, but I could write one and it would be better. So the nature of all this, and I wasn't sure, the plays seemed to be about the same thing, so I'm kind of ended up glomming them together in the argument. But it's actually, when you get done, a really good argument about why the books of chivalry, you ought to read them. Because even the people who think they should be banned can't stop reading them or writing them. So that was kind of, I thought, was it was similar to the the arc of the other one. And then at the end, I think the woman threw them all up, but I don't know that she could read, so it didn't really matter to her. But their discussion, it's like they feel they have to say this because it doesn't meet, the standards of what they feel they should be reading. I mean, the canon says at one point, I've read them all, I don't get through them all. It's kind of like, I don't. So I just thought it was very much the same, and it ends up being like a great, even more than Don Quixote, who obviously took his reading way too far, at least according to the author in the beginning. It's a good advertisement for wanting to read these books, because they make all the arguments about why they actually have a literary value and allow all these very entertaining, interesting stories to be told.
Okay, so this is striking. Both the priest and the canon can speak with a good deal of sense, or at least apparent sense, about what's wrong with these books. And yet both really like some of them. The canon gives a similarly sensible argument as to how books of chivalry and can be well written, what their virtues would be if they were well written, and in the cases in which they're well written. So, I mean, yeah, I mean, Larry in The Republic, Socrates says, God, isn't poetry so sweet? If only it weren't so bad for us. I'd love to keep it around. There's some kind of flavor of the priest and the canon being lovers of these things, even as they see that they're dangerous. So yeah, I mean, the details are all really interesting, but that's a striking general fact about both of them, Cindy. Thanks. Steve, go ahead.
I could not help but visualize like a long New York Times book review, on an essay like where they're, on a genre where the person is being really learned and they're just skewering this whole series of books. And you read it to the end, and then you read the author's bio. You see where it notes that, critic X might say has a book coming out next month on this subject. Mm-hmm. And it's just, I mean, to me, this was a total, I don't know what the notion of art criticism or literary criticism was in Cervantes' time, but I think he's skewering, and whether it's the priests who are doing it or playing the role of literary critic, but I think this is just absolutely underlying the hypocrisy of, and I think there actually is some history of the church trying to suppress, fantastical books in favor of the Bible. I don't know whether that had died out in Spain by that point, but I just read this as a lampoon. Like it struck me, every few months the New York Times will have one of these long form essays where, most of the time they're all laudatory. Every once in a while they skewer everything, and you find out the guy is, either writing a book on the subject or this is an excerpt from a book, so he's pushing for his advertisement for the book that's coming out.
So this reading that the canon is a hypocrite suggests what? That, I mean, he's got an argument as to why books of chivalry generally and certain practices in literature more broadly than in books of chivalry, insofar as it talks about plays and so forth, why they're bad, why they're generally poorly written, who's to blame for it. At least the canon and the priest between them have a view. But he also has a theory as to how they go well. I mean, is it just hypocrisy? I take it if you think that he's a hypocrite, you think, well, everything he says about, he doesn't abide by one part of this argument, either the criticism or his like what seems like earnestly advanced description of the positive possibilities of this genre.
Well, I think
is that your reading, Steve? That it's not just that he thinks this genre is failing to live up to its true potential, but that he thinks I secretly love it, or I do it just as badly. I inflict the same harms on everyone, but
well, I think there's I think there's a triangle of sorts, and I'm not going to get it exactly right in terms of where the canon, the priest, and Don Quixote talk about what is truth. Okay, is truth a factual rendition of what actually happened? Mm-hmm. Is it a story that's based on fact, but maybe exaggerated to make sure that so that it titillates the reader and gets the reader to read the story, regardless of whether it's, whether it exactly happened or not. And then there's the fantastical story, which is meant to amaze you and enchant you, and certainly isn't the literal truth, but may contain higher truths. And so I think there's a dialogue going on in terms of what is the nature of literary truth. And so if the priest or the canon were just to make that argument, and kind of you left off on the bio that, oh, by the way, I'm writing a book so I can prove that so it could be a bestseller and make a bunch of money or get me more repute, then probably I'd lower the charge of hypocrisy, or I'd be less suspicious that Cervantes is skewering the profession and the way it's being done. But I think that, again, in this whole notion of what is truth, yes, there's absolutely an argument underlying what the canon is saying. He's advancing it in a totally self-interested means. But I think the three-way dialogue is really this question of what is the higher truth that a work of art or a book should be striving for, and how do you best engage the reader?
Okay, well, why don't we look at what the canon says about the role of truth in these fictional stories is it's fairly concentrated, although it's possible that you could relate what he says on 441 to 442 to this as well. But I'm looking at 440. He says something fairly systematic sounding about what role the truth should play in fictional stories. He says, and if someone replies that the authors of such books write them as fictions and are therefore under no obligation to bother with subtleties or truths, I'd answer by saying that the more a lie looks like the truth, the better a lie it is, and the more feasible it is, the more it pleases us. Fictional stories should suit their readers' understanding and be written in such a way that by making impossibilities seem easy and marvels seem straightforward, and by enthralling the mind, they amaze and astonish, gladden and entertain, so that wonder and pleasure go hand in hand. And none of this can be achieved by the writer who forsakes verisimilitude and imitation, because the perfection of all writing consists in these two qualities. And he'll repeat something similar on 442. He also criticizes works of chivalry for not being well structured, for not having parts that hang together very well, and for being just one episode after another, and perhaps for just offering episodes.
Well, it feels like he's to some degree making the Aristotle poetics argument about what makes for great literature: imitation and balance and structure, and that chivalry's books, by departing from what we really know, and again, this whole question of what do we really know is kind of underscored in that, and the anecdotal or episodic nature of the books of chivalry, and by the way, of the first half of Don Quixote, violate that. Mm-hmm. And again, you have the traditionalist view of literature is not good unless it is like X. And I think part of what Cervantes is proving with his book is the other side of that, is that, yes, this is a loose, baggy monster, kind of like what the canon is criticizing. And we seem to be pretty damn engaged up until this point.
Okay, so you're not saying it fails by the standard of truth that he's offering us, namely that it's not a lie that comes very close, as close to the truth as possible, although maybe it does, but it does fail by the standards of structural coherence that it seems like the canon advances elsewhere. Fair enough. Jesse, you had your hand up, and then Cindy did too. No, Cindy? Also put your hand down? Okay. Any other thoughts about this exchange generally, the passage that I read that seems like the canon's most concentrated expression of his views about what role the truth should play in books of chivalry and maybe literature generally, that it pleases the most. I mean, he'll say elsewhere, its two functions are to instruct and to please, and it pleases the most when it comes as close to the truth as possible. Something very similar to what Socrates says about the noble lie in book 3. Now that you've gotten me onto this, Larry, and now I can't stop. But Charles, go ahead.
What Steve is saying is somewhat related to what I'm going to say, and that is, I thought it was interesting to have this whole, I'll call it, discussion about literature and how it works and what's in it and all that stuck in this novel. I mean, and the only thing I can think of is that Cervantes is attempting to justify, like these New York Times writers justify. He's trying to justify what's going on in his novel, and it's has all these fantastic elements. It has people doing crazy things. And so it's, to me, it's like he's trying to, he inserted almost in the middle of the book this discussion about literature and what I'll call literary criticism as a justification for what he's done and what he's going to do.
Can you say more about that, Charles? How does this discussion of literature justify what Cervantes is doing with the novel on your interpretation?
Well, he talks about the imagination. He talks about an agreeable style, ingenious, inventiveness, and ingenious relates directly, I think, to the title of the novel.
Mm-hmm.
And so, and in a way, he's discussing the beauty of the literature as expressed by some of the characters in the sense of what they do.
So your thought is this right? I was stuck between two interpretations of what you were saying, and now I think which one I should opt for is becoming clearer. Is the thought Cervantes' novel Don Quixote is going to be, by the standards that the canon lays out, a successful novel? Is that right? Because the other thought the other interpretation I was working on of what you were saying was that this is self-justifying. Cervantes' inclusion of this literary critical discussion justifies his own work here, in that he presents what seems like a sensible, when it's considered abstractly, form of criticism of books of chivalry or maybe works of literature more generally. But we can see that it's not a strain of criticism that we should give much credence to when we're in the middle of a novel that it seems the canon wouldn't like, but we can see the value in it anyway, or something like that. In other words, he's satirizing this style of criticizing literature and advocating censoriousness and talking about the dangers of bad works of chivalry and so forth.
Yeah, it's the second one.
Oh, it is the second one. Oh, okay. I thought it was the first one. Interesting. I mean, you might think we're not reading a work of chivalry. We're reading a work that is interested in books of chivalry, and it's a satire of them, and maybe of, you know, more than just them.
And there's some of the first one, but I think it's primarily the second one.
Mhm.
Second. There's something else I was going to say. I'll think of it. Must not be
Okay.
very good.
So on this reading, we're supposed to hear, I mean, this is similar, I think, to Steve's thought and Cindy's, that we're supposed to hear the canon's theory of what makes for good and bad literature and books of chivalry and say, we can't take this seriously. Sensible as it may seem, you know, it's as if Cervantes is inoculating us to sensible seeming arguments as to how literature goes wrong and is harmful by giving us a sensible seeming one and then setting us up not to believe in it because we're reading a novel that defies the canon sensibilities, and yet that we see the value in nevertheless.
Yes.
Okay. Any other thoughts about this exchange? Oh, sorry, Charles, did you have more on this?
The other thing I was going to say was, if I'm not mistaken, Don Quixote is coherent all through this discussion. I mean, he's not tilting at literary windmills, so to speak. He's discussing this topic with the canon and the priest. He's not just a punching bag.
So we should take his understanding of the value of books of chivalry seriously. Is that what you're saying?
His point of view, yes.
Yeah. Thanks. Other thoughts about this exchange between the canon, the priest, and the Don Quixote? Yeah, Gary?
I think one interesting thing that we haven't touched on is the defense, no, not really the defense, the proposal of having censorship, and that censorship can lead to the kinds of literature that the canon is proposing. That if playwrights knew that their work could be censored, they would submit far better work. I mean, it's just a straightforward, there should be a censor. And it almost reads as though, because there's no, a lot of these arguments, sometimes you'll see there'll be an argument kind of with both sides built into it. This one isn't. This is just a straightforward, it would really be good to have somebody who could just say no to these people, which you'd think is the very last thing an author would ever propose, at least with a straight face. And it's hard to know exactly why it's there. It sort of isn't part of that theme you've been talking about. And it's almost as though it's Cervantes saying, see, this book here of mine is so good that even a censor would pass it with flying colors. In fact, I'm proposing that we have one. And I don't know, you know, I mean, this is Spain after all, and you know, in Spain, the church had enormous political power. And while he's not, I don't think he's proposing a church-based censor. He's talking about local authorities. You know, I've got to think that there was a lot of pressure on the arts in Spain. And I know Spain, I don't know much about Spanish literature, but I know it had a pretty rich tradition for at least a couple of hundred years. There had to be a lot of pressure on artists and writers from religious authorities about the content of their work. And it's almost as though this is kind of an affirmative defense.
Of censorship.
Of the literature of literature like this being so good that we don't even need to fear a censor.
Yeah, okay, I mean, that's interesting. So that aspect of it seems actually to be taken account of, or at least acknowledged by the priest who's making this proposal on page 446. So on 445 to 446, he says, some playwrights blame audiences, or maybe it's impresarios. You know, there are two questions that it seems like are on the canons in the priest's mind. Who's to blame for bad literature, harmful literature, and who can do something about it? And in this section on 445 to 446, the priest says, I think, you know, people, some either, and now I'm forgetting whether it's authors or playwrights or actors or impresarios, blame the public for the bad plays that they write. They say, you know, nobody would like it if we wrote good plays. And then he says, but we have examples of really great plays that have been beloved by the public. And the priest goes on to say, well, a censor would help us weed out the bad plays, the harmful plays, and ensure that only the good ones are written, that standards are imposed on whatever it is that comes before the eyes of the public. I mean, to me, the present state of things suggests, I mean, that description suggests that a censor isn't essential for producing any good works of literature or plays, because some people already produce good plays that are both edifying and you know, good plays by whatever artistic standards the priest and canon have in mind, and that also please audiences. So, I mean, you'd expect that maybe Cervantes need not be defying this proposal for censorship if it doesn't, you know, censorship isn't essential, so the priest is saying, for ushering both good and popular works into the world. It's just a kind of safeguard against, on the priest's view, having both some popular and artistically meritorious works and many more popular and artistically bankrupt works. So, I mean, I guess that makes me think, is that Cervantes like throwing his weight against the priest's views here? If a novel like this or a work of great literary quality can spring up without a censor, even on the priest's view? I mean, it's as if the priest has anticipated the same objection, and he's saying, yeah, no, censorship isn't essential for producing any good works, but it would weed out a lot of the bad ones. What do you think, Gary?
You know, he doesn't actually propose that anything be censored. What he's really saying is, if there is such a person, then he calls them the actors who are going to be submitting these plays, but they're not going to submit bad plays. They're going to submit, their work is going to be improved. And what we'll see is a general, you know, rise in the quality of Spanish art.
Okay, fair enough. Charles, go ahead.
The way I read that was that this censor, this person, would review things before they were actually performed or published, to make sure that they fit in with whatever the censor's views were, not necessarily to make them better, but to make sure that they weren't going to, in my view, offend the church. And so it was a pre-clearance kind of thing.
I mean, I'm not sure that the only thing that's at issue in the priest's recommendation is whether the plays that should be censored are blasphemous or heretical in some way, or, you know, illicit by church standards. It seems like he thinks plays, I mean, he praises plays for having great wit, being elegant, having excellent speeches and weighty maxims. This is on the top of 446. Being eloquent and lofty in style. So you'd think that the censor is meant to prevent plays from getting through that aren't like that, even if the censor might also be preventing plays that are harmfully untrue or maybe immoral from getting through. I'm not sure, but it seems like it's not the only thing on his mind. What do you think, Charles?
Well, at that paragraph on 446, the last thing is the avoidance of the trouble of punishing them. And so if they published something or wrote something that wasn't, quote, I'll say the party line, they're going to be punished. And who's going to punish them? The church. Or the local authorities. So
look at the end of the first paragraph on 446. He says that these people are being punished the actors are being punished for scenes that insult kings or dishonor families. I don't think those are religious transgressions. It seems like they're offenses to the local powerful people.
Okay, well, to me, the church and the king are the same thing.
Okay,
Same person.
fair enough. So it's if there's punishment that these actors suffer on occasion, it's because they've offended local authorities or authorities. I guess the king need not be understood as local, but of some kind, maybe religious and secular and some combination of the two.
Yeah.
And the censor would prevent that kind of thing from creeping into plays, maybe among other things.
Keeping them out of hot water,
Karin?
literally.
When I read this the first time, I clearly took away the idea of censorship. But I'm having another thought since we're having this discussion. I have a lot of assumptions in my mind about what's behind censorship. And of course, this was the canon proposing it, and it was all about protecting church and king. But there is this strong theme in these paragraphs about actually improving the quality of the work. And so it just occurred to me, it's kind of interesting that there's a fine line sometimes between editors and censors. And I think in this day and age, there weren't editors. People wrote their works and they published them. But it just strikes me as a very interesting, an early concept of editing. Also, this idea of, someone who can help people bring out their best work and improve the overall quality of the work. So I just decided to offer that. I have writing background myself, and editors, there are those editors that really do truly improve the work, and then there are editors that totally change it. So it's an interesting concept.
Yeah, I'm with you, Karin. I think the emphasis is far more on the artistic merit of the plays. That seems to be the role for the censor that the priest is envisioning here, that a censor would ensure that actually plays of good quality, not just plays that are on the right sides of the prevailing authorities, religious or secular, make it to the stage. I mean, if you look at the paragraph at the middle of 445, the priest says, the role of laws, he's saying, why would we need laws to oblige people who write and perform plays to do so in a proper way? Because any old play will do the job. To this I'd reply that this end, namely to delight, what is the end? No, there are various ends. In any case, to this end, I'd reply that this end would be far, far better achieved with good plays than with bad ones, because the audience that has gone to see an ingenious and well-crafted play comes out at the end, cheered by its jests, instructed by its truths, amazed at its action, wiser thanks to its speeches, warned by its roguery, shrewder for its examples, incensed against vice and enamored of virtue. So I think some of these ends, some of these qualities of a good play are moral. Some of them, it just seems like have to do with ingeniousness and craft. And that's much closer to what an editor, in the sense in which we think of them, are concerned with promoting in a play or another work of literature. So I think the role for the censor, it seems like it's that the priest is envisioning, it's largely aesthetic. They have aesthetic standards that they're going to impose on the sea of trash that gets put on the Spanish stage. That seems to be the priest's view, as well as some moral standards. So yeah, I think that's right. April, go ahead.
This part seemed like a totally different voice to me when we got to the canon speaking, and I thought it was really interesting how serious in the deep dive we went into literature, what's good literature, what's bad literature, who has the authority to call literature good or bad. I'm thinking back to Larry's, 3 layers of structure that he mentioned, and the authoritative layer to frame all this. It's just interesting to me. I thought the first time I read it, I got the censorship, but then the second time I read it through, I thought, well, maybe it's the author telling us there's merit to all kinds of literature, right? To entertain is not such a bad thing, because you do start to point out you cheer the audience, but you also start to point out some different truths and some moral things come across. But I thought the tone completely changed when the canon was speaking about literature.
So wait, on that reading, maybe I'm mishearing you, April. So this sounds like the first of the interpretations that I had of what Charles was saying earlier, that Charles said, no, the second one is what I meant. So do you think that Quixote thinks that good literature, like what he's written, presumably, excuse me, I said Quixote, I meant Cervantes. Cervantes thinks that good literature like this novel is good in the sense in which the canon and the priest envision good literature to be good, namely, it is well structured, it approaches the truth, it's ingenious and eloquent and elegant in its in the writing, and it therefore edifies even as it pleases. Is that right?
I think more who gets to decide what's good literature and for what reasons, right? I think Cervantes is saying, I think by having this passage and it's so authoritative and the canon comes in and he's this, he's definitely an authority figure. His describing what good literature is, I think it causes the reader to question, like, well, do I believe what he has to say? Just like sometimes when Don Quixote does something, we think, is there a nugget of truth in there somewhere? I think this was inserted for reasons to whisper to the reader, like, hey, what do you think about good literature? Do you believe certain things to be good and certain things are there merits in different types of literature? Do you believe what someone tells you because they have authority on their side? Or are you going to choose for yourself? Like, is this silly book I've written, is it actually good literature?
Mm-hmm. Okay, this is another, in my head, connection to Plato. You have characters make a bunch of arguments about how we ought to think about something as a way to provoke the reader into saying, is that right? Where do I agree and disagree? Where do I stick with the canon and think he's full of hot air and so forth? And that seems especially apt in a work of literature as complex as this one, in that we should be thinking about that anyway. Like, what is Cervantes doing to us here? Why is this succeeding if it's succeeding? It's an interesting thought. Let me ask about one other line that the canon has that it's fairly isolated, but I want to know what you all think of it. So in chapter 49 on page 452, he says that one reason that he thinks bad works of literature, maybe books of chivalry in particular, are harmful. Let's see. So I'm going to start at the bottom of page 451. He says, speaking for myself, I can say that when I read them, books of chivalry, they give me some pleasure so long as I overlook the fact that they're all folly and falsehood. But as soon as I remember what they are, I dash the best of them against the wall, and I'd even hurl it into the fire if there were one handy, because they all deserve this punishment for being cheats and imposters and beyond the pale of common nature, for inventing new sects and a new way of life, and for inducing the ignorant rabble to accept as truths all the absurdities they contain. So what I think is especially interesting about this is that the earlier criticism that these works are bad, maybe even harmful, insofar as they produce falsehoods that depart too widely from the truth, and that they're poorly structured, doesn't quite have the flavor. I mean, you might think that that's a broader version of the narrower criticism that comes in here, namely that these works invent new sects and a new way of life. I mean, so that makes it seem like the canon charges books of chivalry not just with misleading people in general, but for setting up alternative religions for them. Inventing new sects and new ways of life. And that's new and interesting. And it's, I think, clearly related to this analogy that we've been working with throughout Don Quixote, comparing his conception of himself as a knight errant to someone who's conceives of themselves as a saint or a devotee of religious scripture, religious teaching. So what do you make of this version of the canon's criticism that books of chivalry invent new sects and new ways of life? Any thoughts about just this, John?
Yeah, I think it confirms what we've talked about before, that Cervantes is saying through him that the book is more than just a satire on chivalry, not books of chivalry. It is about the broader concept of dogma, or in modern day, we'd be talking about propaganda, or anything that creates a not just religion, but political sects, and based on untruths that lead people astray, lead whole groups of people astray, not just one guy or two guys. And so I think he's using him to make the statement that it is broader than just chivalry.
So wait, John, that's interesting. The comparison to propaganda strikes me as especially interesting. But like, so do you think, I'm snatching a bit at what I was hearing and how you answered this, but do you think the canon is right about this, that literary genres, or maybe the entries into literary genres, do create effectively new sects, religious or secular, and new ways of life?
No.
Oh, okay.
That's what Cervantes is saying. I think to the extent you look at it beyond that, and you talk about political and religious sects that go over the top, authoritarian type situations, etc. That's different from just talking about literature, fiction, that is just painting a picture of something. And in this case, one guy gets carried away, goes mad, and tries to live it out.
Okay, so this is one of these, Quixote is not like us readings. He's an exception, not the rule. We can't really see ourselves in him. Maybe there's a new sect and way of life created for this one madman, but it doesn't do that. Literature doesn't do that to the majority of us.
No, not the same.
Okay, thanks. Steve, go ahead.
I think I'm going to take the contrary view. I think that he actually is positing that literature can create a new way of living. I think that again, the timing is important. I mean, Martin Luther is, half a century in the past, but Spain hasn't accepted that. Spain is still a Catholic country. And I think the danger might be off by more than that. Because Martin Luther is what, mid 16th century, and we're okay. So we're okay, it's a little bit off that. But I do think the notion of seeing literature as a vehicle to giving people a vision of a new order is both not satirical. I think that is a real fear that he's striking, and I think for good reason. I think that this is an example of where Cervantes is making a very serious argument, and he couches it in, or he puts the words in mouths where that dangerous argument gives him plausible deniability for him being the heretic or him putting out something. I mean, we talked a little bit earlier in terms of one of the arguments earlier in the book about religion being between a crazy knight and a overbearing peasant as a way of defending Cervantes from being accused of being a heretic. But I think here he's putting in the mouths of the priest the real concern that he had. I mean, that again, from one perspective, was truly seen as a danger.
And do you think that, so on that reading, Steve, is this a veiled reference to the kind of thing that Luther did, namely to self-consciously develop a new religious sect, or is it actually about literary texts creating new sects and ways of life? I mean, so one thought.
Yeah, I don't know if it's an either or. I think there are elements of both.
You know, this novel is populated by these groups of people who seem like they are converts of a certain kind. I mean, the wandering shepherds who've gotten some ideas about love from pastoral novels and works of poetry. They're pretty similar to Quixote. You know, we brought up romantic comedies and various other genres that we, in whatever way that they work on us, we model our behavior and our conceptions of particular kinds of areas of human life on what we get from those genres. So I guess the thought could be like, is Cervantes actually standing behind the idea that literary genres and the entries into them create new sects and ways of life? Or is this just
I absolutely do.
An analogy for something?
I think you can read Don Quixote, or at least the part that we've read so far, as being an argument for, or argument against the status quo. I mean, the whole nature, I mean, the important that ideals, both of love and of the nature of the role of protecting the poor against the privileged is very, you know, there's a not subtle subtext of challenging power, which I think is, you know, again, taking the other side of censorship. Again, I think that the passage we talked about earlier, Karin's quite right, that that's more about the editorial version. Like, this is more towards the fear of what great literature can do, which is give people a different vision of what the future might hold or what their lives could be.
Mm-hmm. John, I saw your digital hand go up and then go down. Do you want to down? Okay, and Gary, go ahead.
I mean, you know, schisms don't always start out as schisms. I mean, Martin Luther didn't intend to start a whole series of new religions. He intended to reform the church. I don't know if things got a little away from him, although they definitely did. But I mean, if you take it literally, you know, Quixote is a dangerous character in terms of the status quo. He's a guy that goes off on his own. He creates his own laws. I mean, right? He says knights errant, of which he apparently was the only one at the time. They don't owe anybody anything. They don't have to pay for anything. They don't have to follow the laws. They're immune, if you will, if they harm other people. I mean, so there's a real kind of rebellious undertone to the whole Quixote story. Now, whether when, you know, he's talking about the creation of sects, that's what he's talking about. I don't know. I mean, I still think we're too early into this novel to know where this is headed or what it means. But taken literally, Quixote is a real danger to authority, and Spain is still a pretty authoritarian place.
Great. Okay, so I mean, that reminds me a lot of Karin's gloss on the madness of the lovers that we've seen. I think it was Karin. I asked, what does their madness entail? And I suggested monomania, and Karin said, well, they're stuck on one object. They care about one person and devalue anything else that might have either to other people or in their prior life before this conversion experience of falling in love have felt important to them, namely, what their parents care about, or their social standing, or not looking ridiculous, or holding on to their money or something like that. And Gary, so you're saying Quixote is a convert of a different kind. I think this is characteristic of conversion experiences. And I think it's also characteristic of genres to define some things as valuable and others as beyond the concern of the characters in a particular genre. So on your reading, Gary, just as the lovers drop all values aside from pursuit of their beloveds, Quixote drops the kind of values that the people around him might share and has this new chivalric code that no one else recognizes, even if they know what he's talking about. He doesn't recognize the authority of the king to punish prisoners. He has his own rules about what you do when you find someone at a crossing who looks at you the wrong way or whatever, or seems to you like they're up to no good. So there is really anybody who occupies one of these genres, whether it's a sect in the paradigmatic sense, a religion, or a love story, or a knight errant, is someone who's makes a break with the values of the people around them who aren't in on that same world, literary or religious. And that's striking. If that's the right way to understand how Quixote's embrace of his peculiar genre, books of chivalry, explains his being an oddball, then maybe the canon is right that these literary works and genres create new sects. If he means by that they create people with values that are different from those of the rest of us who don't buy into the same genre, then Quixote is like a living testament to that. Any reaction to that, Gary?
Yeah, no, I think that's right. Except I think Quixote is a dimension beyond these sort of lover stories. I mean, the lover stories are very, personal. They're confronting convention. They're confronting social mores in their own particular circumstances. Quixote seems to me is doing something much broader and much, you could argue, more dangerous. I mean, he's basically saying the laws don't apply to me. I answer to a higher authority, and my rules supersede all of yours. And that is, that's rebellion of a kind. If there were lots of other knight errants, I think there'd be a problem in Spain, but happily he's the only one.
Yeah, it's funny that they share a code and yet they all seem to be laws unto themselves. I don't know how that works in practice, but I don't think he'll meet another genuine knight errant in the novel, so we'll never know.
Yeah, the other thing, if I could just mention, one thing that I think we sometimes ignore because we're not hit in the face with it is the sort of religiosity of life in Spain. I mean, my sense is that Cervantes doesn't need to hit you over the head with references to religious beliefs because it was so fundamentally a part of Spanish society and Spanish law and the way people's lives were governed at the time. So, when we read through the list of things that literature can do or what it's for, and there's only that one little mention of moral values, I think that's because, throughout this book, everything about these people's lives, maybe unthinkingly and never spoken, not often spoken aloud, is controlled by their religious beliefs and the sort of the religious orientation of society. And you know, if you just look at the characters, I mean, how often are there priests or ecclesiastical figures, and all these sort of moral codes, things about the way women are treated, among other things, my guess all derive from the Spanish church. So I just think we tend to import, you know, our 21st century values. And I think that is just such a part of the Spanish scene that it's important to keep it in mind.
So it's almost like that it's not foregrounded very often is a testament to its being ubiquitous and taken for granted on that reading. Thanks. Karin, go ahead, and then Charles.
Just to add to this idea of sex, having read some of the chivalric tales, I mean, there's some reality to this actually, because there were sects that arose, particularly during the Crusades. An example would be the Knights Templar and other brotherhoods and secret societies like that arose, well, particularly during the Crusades. And I haven't read much lately, but my understanding was that to some degree it was a threat to the church, because these secret societies gained a lot of power and sometimes were supported by kings versus the church. But in any case, there was some real history behind that, and you know, a priest or a canon talking about it might really see it as a real as a real threat to the church. So I thought I'd add that in.
Creating sects is genuinely a danger to religious authorities.
Yeah,
Even if
I mean,
he's
not-
talking about an unusual way of creating them, namely by having the wrong works of literature circulating about.
Well, by making them attractive and romantic, probably, it could attract more people to it. But what I was really getting at is not sex as in a new branch of Christianity, but sects as in small, elite, secretive groups and societies, you know, that existed at the time as part of these chivalric tales.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's an interesting thought. Charles, go ahead.
Somewhat related to that is the new way of life. I think in that sentence, that's even more radical than new sex. I mean, to have somebody to start a new way of life, as in Jesus Christ and his apostles, that was pretty radical back then. And with these priests or the canon, whichever one it is, I don't know. He's talking about not just the sex, because I think the church was worried about these sects and what they might do to their stranglehold on their flock. But a new way of life is even, in my view, more radical and could be much more disruptive to the established order.
Mm-hmm. So the canon here seems to think that they go together, but
Yes.
maybe we could consider them independently of one another. And you know, having somebody who belongs to a new sect, but whose way of life is very similar to, say, the old whatever authority is from which they're breaking, secular or religious, is less challenging than someone who adopts a new way of life relative to the old ways. I think that's well observed. It's a subtle,
I think
but
so. Okay.
seems like an important distinction. Yeah, say it again, Charles.
That's what I was saying.
Yeah, it's an interesting thought. Okay, well, I'm gonna move us on from this literary critical discussion. We didn't talk much about what Quixote says in defense of the books of chivalry, but I guess it's not especially unusual in this passage relative to other passages in which he defends books of chivalry, and there's lots more to talk about, so why don't we just move on. So we've talked a bit about, only in passing, obliquely, about Eugenio in Spanish, and Leandra, this young woman with whom he was in love, whom he was courting, and who ran away with this guy dressed up in fancy clothes, who seduced her and played the guitar well and robbed her and left her in a cave. So this is another courtship story gone wrong. It's another case where like a bunch of guys who are heartsick become shepherds. Right, so it's a variation on a few themes that we've gotten. What do you make of this one? Do the individual elements here line up in interesting ways with elements from other love stories that we've gotten? I'll give you one to start with. I mean, I thought it was interesting that the last love story we got in today's reading, the first one that we talked about, happened entirely at a distance, where Don Luis, it seems, could only on the basis of his appearance win the heart of Doña Clara. He did it from beyond her windows with his poetry and his voice, and she took his whatever she could see of him and hear of him from beyond her windows as signs of his true love for her. Whereas here we've got a guy who's like decked out in superficial indications of wealth and or maybe of style. I don't know what in Vicente, and Leandra is her judgment is, it seems, perverted by this guy's tricks. She chooses poorly. This guy was not devoted to her. Is there any connection there, or any thoughts about just this story in a line of courtship and love stories and stories of heartbreak that we've gotten? Yeah, Steve.
I mean, this is maybe reading more into it, but I mean, this is the last of the stories in the book that Cervantes initially creates. I mean, this is one of the end of part one. That was, if the other guy hadn't written part two, we might never have gotten part two. So to some degree, I saw this almost as a summing up in a way, and it has, many of both the good and the bad things we pointed out in the other stories. Again, we have, the obsessive love. Ironically, this time it's the male who's the obsessor, not the female who's the obsessor. And that we've seen that before, but the notion of the woman who falls for the fraud, kind of reinforces what we've seen so much, which is, the women need to be protected, or they're gullible, or they can be persuaded. It's a lot of objectifying and nothing terribly wonderful about that, but the end result that the men, multiples, are out there in the countryside bemoaning their fate as a result of the woman who fell for the guy who are, at one level outsmarted them all. To me, this paints a kind of a portrait of the sexes and love, kind of a summary story here in terms of the downside, the power of this kind of love that he's been describing in 5 or 6 different ways. And again, not in a pretty way, because this one does not have a happy ending for anybody.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, it leaves Eugenio an interspecies misogynist. It seems like he curses females of any species, the goats as well as human, at least 2. So the reading is, this is a kind of culminating love story. It's the last one that we get in part 1, and it's got a lot of elements from the previous ones, but pretty dark. Any other thoughts about this particular love story, story of courtship and heartbreak and deception. All right, well, we have other things to talk about. Oh yeah, go ahead, April.
Say, I was struck by the reaction of the goat herd to Don Quixote. It was like, oh, I totally believe you and all this. And then after this long drawn out story, the goat herd's reaction to Don Quixote is, who's this joker? Like, I thought that was very interesting, that he loved his own story and then someone else was drawn into it and he was like, what are you talking about? So I thought that was very, I don't know, it was just very interesting to have that point of view. We all are going to listen to your story and dive into it 100%, but then someone else's story, you're not as convinced.
That's interesting. I mean, that's making me think now about the conversation we just had about about people who are trapped in their own genres and unable to, in different sects or way of life and unsympathetic to the others, right? So this strikes me as a moment where we've got a guy in one genre, Don Quixote, meeting a guy in a different one, like Eugenio in a pastoral novel, or maybe a figure from poetry, this love-lone, misogynistic, pan-misogynistic goat herd who curses woman's bad judgment and fickleness and so forth. And that Eugenio is unsympathetic to Quixote's offer to intervene in the way a knight errant would in his own story suggests like the limitations of his sympathetic imagination, saying, your genre is ridiculous, or, that you're so taken in by your story is ridiculous, even though he's trapped in his own. I hadn't quite thought about it that way, but it's an interesting observation. What do you make of Eugenio's unfriendliness to Quixote? Do you think, April, was this your reading as well, that it's a bit silly for him to be to come off as like a little bit mad himself and then to not be sympathetic to Quixote's madness?
It didn't strike me as madness with the goat herd. It struck me as so lost in his own story that he couldn't indulge others in any of their. He also couldn't share the spotlight, right? Which is something Don Quixote has a problem with too. Don Quixote loves his own stories so much he's got to insert his, heroic efforts into everything. But I just thought it was just a striking difference between this big story and then boom, what are you talking about?
Mm-hmm.
And then ends in like a brawl.
Yeah, thanks. Steve, go ahead.
Well, I think I think it's exactly right, but I think no one takes Don Quixote's offer seriously. The Princess Micomicona buys into this story as a joke, partly as a joke and partly as a way to help him, to get him back, to lead him back to home base where he can be taken care of. But I think you're right. This is the fact that everybody takes his offer and shakes their head at it. From the lover's standpoint, no one is taking his offer to redeem the world or redeem the love as anything other than a fantasy.
Aside from Sancho Panza, he's the only one I can think of who thinks Quixote might actually make good on his promises. Yeah, fair enough. So this is actually a representative reaction from Eugenio. Maybe not the hostility, but at least his not taking Quixote seriously. That seems like something that lots of lovers have done in the story thus far. Okay, unless there are other thoughts about this, I will move us on. All right. Right at the end of the novel, or excuse me, of part 1 in chapter 52, before we get these poems that our author says were found in a lead casket in a ruined chapel, he notes that he only asks for his readers that they give the same credit to his original and matchless history that people of good sense give to books of chivalry so highly prized by all. Seems like there are two ways we can take this. it's earnestly meant, or it's maybe three ways. It's earnestly meant, if this is a kind of joke, or it's some combination of both. What do you think? How should we read that note? Any thoughts about this? I do have more questions. Yeah, go ahead, Gary. Go ahead.
Okay, I'll take a shot at it, although I think this is probably so far off the mark. One of the things I keep thinking about, probably without much reason to, is 1001 Nights as a sort of parallel kind of book. And it's been a million years since I tried to read it, so I'll probably get it wrong. But the thing that struck me is the similarity is it's a collection of stories with a framing device that holds the stories together, right? So in 1001 Nights, it's Scheherazade and not wanting to be murdered after her one night of marital bliss and telling story after story. So you've got this Scheherazade story. And here, I don't know, maybe there are a couple of framing devices that tie all these stories together. I mean, there's obviously Don Quixote, who's kind of a framing device for all of these stories. Although what's interesting about this book is that the framing device actually becomes part of the stories. But you also have this narrator, author, Cervantes, whoever the hell he is, who's telling us what's going on in terms of how it is that this manuscript has been created or discovered. And that's what I took it for. I took it for a continuation of this sort of, tree that they hang these, the stories get hung off the tree, and the tree holds it all together. And part of that is this mysterious voice we keep coming back to and not knowing who he is, but he's appearing here again. So I didn't take it as any more than that. I took it as sort of this strange kind of structural mechanism that Cervantes created.
So it's got to be at least that there's this device of the author speaking to us directly about the research that he's done and his hopes for the novel. He did that in the prologue to part one. And in a way, he'll do it in the prologue to part two, although it's kind of different. But like, why does he say in particular here, all he hopes is that his readers give this the same credit that people of good sense give to books of chivalry, so highly prized by all? Why have that be among the author's sentiments? I mean, in the prologue to part one, if you remember from our discussion, he seems, by his just blanket approval of what his clever and lively friend says, I think it's clever and lively, to agree that the point of this work is a demolition of all books of chivalry or something like that. And here he's saying, if only you give as much credit to this work as you do, as is given by people of good sense to books of chivalry, so highly prized by all, I'll be happy. That's really odd. I mean, it's definitely in the frame that you're describing. I think it was an apt characterization of it, Gary. But like, why does it have this content in particular? Is my question. Do you have any thoughts about that, or
Actually, it just seemed to me to be the same sort of, I don't know how to characterize the voice, almost a mocking kind of voice, a kind of humorous, and here, gentle reader, is, and then you tell it what it is, but you're not, that's not the truth, because this is a work of fiction, and this is a fictional voice, and it just, I can't really explain it other than it has a tone that pulls me into the story.
Thanks, Charles.
This doesn't answer your question, but I noticed on 474 and 475, the author is inserting himself into this novel again. It's not Don Quixote speaking, it's the author. And I just find that interesting. I don't know what the purpose is, other than to let us know that this is not a crazy person or a mad person speaking here. It's the Cervantes or whoever the author is. Because he says, all the author of this history, and then about 8 lines down, and then, but the author could not discover any information. And then about the 5th line from the top, he's a trustworthy author of this original and matchless history. So I just think it's interesting that he's inserting himself into this again right before the end of part 1.
Yeah, agreed. And he does it again at the beginning of part 2. So I'm going to ask about that as well. But Marge, you had a thought?
Well, yeah, it was kind of the same thing that jumped out at me. It was sort of like, and authors have used this a lot since, it's ending where he started. Kind of, he's wrapping it up. He's putting bookends on it. And it tells you this story is coming, it's coming to an end right now, but he leaves the door open, It's sort of like, as I read it, I thought, oh, okay, he's leaving the door open in case they pick up the series again.
Yeah.
So I can continue, or I could call it quits here.
And interestingly, at the beginning of part 2, he says, I'm going to close the door definitively with my second part. Don Quixote is going to die. So that's interesting, Marge. So the thought is like, we've gotten a frame in the prologue of part 1. This author's voice has come in a number of times along the way. And in this final chapter of part 1, he closes the frame with a similar style of address as we got in the prologue, that leaves the idea of a sequel open, but gives us a symmetry with the beginning of the beginning of the month. Okay, thank you. John?
This is probably a very minor point about it, but the author does go across multiple genres throughout the book. We are in a sort of a comedic parody or satire for a while with Don Quixote, and then we go into these multiple dramatic love stories, sometimes a little tragic, sometimes a little comedic, sometimes a little both. And we have this essay type thing with the canon and the priest and Don Quixote. Somebody talked about it. I think somebody commented that it was like New York Times op-ed. And then at the end, we have poetry like we had at the beginning. And there was a little bit of poetry spread out throughout. So and that's what, maybe that's part of the reason why it's referred to as the first novel, maybe the first modern novel, because of all the different genres built into it.
Yeah, I do think that's
part of it. That's something that struck me. And all of a sudden he throws these poems in at the end. And I remember them being at the beginning too.
Yeah, I thought you were going to add, this is also a work of history, or at least it has the notes of being a work of history. It's discussion of being in the archives and looking at the lost sources.
That too. Yeah. There's that too.
Interesting. So okay,
historical is another story, but
no, they're clearly not.
It refers to historical information is thrown in amongst the fiction.
Yeah, it's a mock work of history. It's like a mock.
Yeah.
So let's talk about the author coming in again in the prologue to part 2. What do you make of this note at the beginning of part 2? right? So this strange thing has happened after the writing of part one. I'm sure Cervantes loved and hated it, that somebody else pseudonymously wrote a second part of Don Quixote. And Cervantes has a huge amount of fun with this in part two of his own Don Quixote. What is he trying to do with this prologue? You know, clearly this is an occasion to work through similar themes to do with authorship, authenticity, transmission of recorded narratives. What's going on in this prologue? Any thoughts about this? Yeah, Steve?
When I was telling one of my daughters, who's in 30s, he's well out of school and on a job, and describing what am I reading, and I described Don Quixote because he was like kind of rolling her eyes, and I described this, okay, the whole prologue after coming back after someone else had written the a second part, which said, oh wow, so that's like fan fiction. Okay, this is where someone else takes it on, and the whole notion, which now is a very popular one, that fans can write their own sequels and add them on. We kind of, at least that, the younger generation takes that for granted. This is, Cervantes' attempt to regain control of his narrative. Mm-hmm. And, by damning with faint praise, he can't threaten a lawsuit, or maybe he can, but there's no copyright laws that anyone would respect. Again, there's only power and the ability to apply it, but he's got none of those. So I think this is a little bit of the kind of making a virtue out of necessity. Uh-huh. and trying to, like I said, regaining control of his own novel from his fans to some degree. His fans are obviously competitors, and people are trying to make a buck off of his intellectual property.
So you think he's genuinely put out by this second part of Quixote that somebody's written pseudonymously, and he's taking back the narrative here, playing along, laughing so that to stop himself from crying. He's being a good sport when really he's angry. Yeah, John.
I thought he was pissed off, and I thought he was taking a swipe at him, trying to be funny about it. But I didn't like it. I thought it was a low point of the book so far. I thought it was a waste of space of the book, and it was disappointing to me. I just thought he was, it's my book, and I'm going to take this space to slam the guy before I go on to my part two. That's where I took it. And
I'm afraid,
he told those two cute little stories and injected a little levity with that, but I thought it was mostly, I'm pissed off about this, and I'm gonna, it's my book, and I'm gonna take these few pages to take a swipe before I do my own part two. If he was gonna do it, he had the remarkable ability to do a lot cleverer, do it in a lot cleverer way without doing it in the obvious way he did. I think that's just my 2 cents.
Fair enough. Well, I mean, you'll see throughout part two, he's going to return to insulting, undermining, playing with the pseudonymous author over and over again. So maybe he'll do it more artfully on your view later on, John. I'll be curious to hear it. I hope it doesn't turn you off the whole second part. Jesse, go ahead.
I actually thought it was pretty clever. I mean, what options really would he have? I mean, he like just decides, I'm just going to face this. I'm just going to look this thing in the eye. I'm going to call it for what it is. And I mean, what else could he do? Really, he had the public's attention, and he was going to defend himself. And I thought it was cleverly done. So I had a different feeling about it than you, John.
Steve?
I mean, I think I actually found it very much in line with the tone of the first part of the novel. I mean, this is a whole question of who's actually writing this story. I mean, we've been given 3 or 4 different versions of it, and to some degree, reality threw in a 5th. I mean, this is one where we've got, who is the I of the first sentence, right from the get-go. We've got Sidi Hamete Benengali's manuscript who we're finding. We've got this, purportedly and apparently truly someone going off and writing a bit of fan fiction based on what he's got. And they've got Cervantes, reasserting that he has the true story. I mean, again, I think it's put one more level in where quite literally fiction meets reality.
Yeah, I think it's really like ironic for an author who starts out his great novel saying, look, this is all a pack of lies. To have to face a crisis of his own authority or the authenticity of another book, given that he seems to, I mean, it's almost like he set himself up for someone else to do this. Gary, go ahead.
Well, my sense is that this was a big deal at the time. I mean, this was Cervantes, the first volume. I think Cervantes did extremely well financially, and I think it became very popular very quickly. And I'm just going to guess that it was a big deal, and probably people were waiting to hear something. That's just a guess. The other thing I'd say is that during the Renaissance, writers wrote lots of letters to one another, and the letters got circulated. I mean, it was a big part of sort of not fiction, but of authorial output, right? People expected to read what writers had written to other writers, what philosophers wrote to other philosophers. There was a whole tradition of that for a couple of centuries, and I took it sort of that way, that it's both a response to what everybody were probably talking about, and also was sort of it was expected.
That's really interesting. I mean, right, so this author of this, I don't know if apocryphal is the right word, but apocryphal second part of Don Quixote, he's pseudonymous. So you can't write him a letter in the ordinary sense. So what do? Well, address him in your prologue. It's a public document. So that's an interesting thought, like the way that you adhere to that literary convention of publishing your thoughts about another author in the form of a letter is to put it in the prologue to the second part that in some sense attacks, repudiates, responds to the second part written by another author. I mean, I think you've got to be right, Gary, from what I've read. The first part of Don Quixote was very widely read as soon as it was published. And I'm sure that this was a known scandal that there was a pseudonymous second part published. So yeah, I mean, I find that persuasive and interesting. We have 2 minutes and we have 2 big questions left. And I don't know, I mean, maybe we should just forego them and keep with this one. Marge, you had your hand up. I saw that creeping up.
It's just one of the thoughts that went through my mind when I was reading it is when he finished part 1, it seemed like he wasn't really quite sure whether it was going to be popular or not, or who was going to read it and what they were going to think of it.
Mm-hmm.
And then it was popular, and it was so popular, somebody even wrote a sequel to it. And I think he wants to call that out. I think he's mad, but I also think he's somewhat flattered and kind of thrilled at his success.
Yeah, that's possible, I suppose. What satire is a form of flattery, or at least, yeah. So, okay, well, question 8 is actually directly related to this question. So, in chapter 2 of part 2, Quixote becomes aware of the part 1 of Don Quixote. He's informed by Sancho that somebody has published part 1. Their stories are all known down to the last detail. What do you make of this? I mean, this is a variation on the same theme in that commentary on part 1 and on its impact on the world is entered into the fiction of Don Quixote, not just the frame of the prologue. Any thoughts about this? How should we interpret it? Is it related to the prologue somehow? Should it make us think differently about part two in any way, that Quixote is making his characters, whereas before, Cervantes is making his characters, in part one, there's a moment, we talked about this briefly, where Quixote envisions himself fairly straightforwardly as a character in a novel being written. But then in part two, it's not just a suspicion. He hears that a novel has indeed been written by Cide Hamete Berengeli. Any thoughts about this? What should it change at all the way we understand part two? Yeah, Steve, final thought.
I mean, it's a little bit of needing to see how it develops, but I mean, it's a very metafictional device. I mean, this is one where we've now thrown in yet another level to this whole question of who is writing the story, about whom, and to whom. Mm-hmm. And I guess I would reserve a detail. I mean, it has a different, it struck me as having a different feel. I mean, the tone of the opening here, I actually went back to the opening one, strikes me as more purposeful than the opening of the book as a whole, or the first part, which struck me as more anecdotal. And I'd be hard pressed at 10:15 to give you the exact chapter and verse on that one. But I do think he's setting up a device that this one seems very purposeful from a structural standpoint. But again, we get another level. I think you talked about that a couple of weeks back, in terms of, from a literary standpoint, in terms of, again, asking fundamentally, what is the truth that's being spoken here?
Mm-hmm. Okay, well, that's a good indication that maybe I should call it a night. You don't have to cite chapter or verse. Go get some sleep. I saw from Karin that she only slept for 4 hours. I imagine you did too.
We had a long night.
Yeah, sorry.
Not your fault.
I'll make this one a little bit shorter, at least. Let me end it there.